The Bank of Japan releases quarterly flow of fund statistics that most people outside the industry never read, and one line item in that report has been consistently strange for about 40 years. Japanese households for most of the post-war decades saved between 15 and 25% of disposable income. American households over the same 40-year window average closer to 5 to 10%, occasionally dipping below 3 during expansion years. Same developed economy, similar wage brackets corrected for cost of living, substantially lower nominal household income in Japan for most of that window, and 2 to 5 times the saving rate. That's not a moral finding. It isn't a Japanese people are different finding. It isn't even primarily a cultural finding in the sense that culture is often invoked to explain things nobody wants to look at more carefully. It's a habit finding. There are, by my count and by the count in the Japanese consumer finance literature that has actually studied this, about 10 repeatable, teachable, non-mystical financial habits that produced that spread, and produced at the individual household level what you could reasonably call quiet wealth. Not silent millionaires as an aspirational category, just households that at 65 have 3 to 5 times what a same income American household has at 65, and got there without any income advantage, any market timing, any inheritance. I want to walk through the 10. This isn't a video about Japan as an exotic destination, it's a video about the mechanism. I should tell you where I'm coming to this from before we start, because it changes what I know and don't know about the practice. Back in 2021, mostly out of curiosity and partly because I was skeptical of the imported versions I'd been seeing in Western personal finance publishing, I ran a Kakeibo for 8 months. Not a spreadsheet version, not an app version, the actual notebook in the actual 4 columns with an actual pen. I bought the ruled notebook Chiba's book points to. I filled in the columns every evening for roughly 240 days. 2 things happened that I did not expect. The first is that the friction did the work, exactly in the way I'd been told it would and exactly in the way I hadn't believed it would. Column 2, once, dropped by about 38% over the first 3 months without me ever setting a target. I wasn't trying to cut once, I was just watching them accumulate in ink in the once column in my own handwriting at the end of each day. And I stopped wanting the once. That is what the practice does. I hadn't expected the emotional flatness of it. It doesn't feel like discipline, it feels like the wants become boring on their own. The second thing that happened is that the annual savings rate rose by roughly 9 points, from about 11% to about 20%, without me ever taking an explicit action to redirect income. The savings rate just moved because column 2 moved. I hadn't done anything with the pay yourself first architecture yet. I'd only kept the notebook. That's how strong the mechanism is when you actually run it in the physical form the tradition specifies. I bring this up because I want you to know that the rest of what I'm going to describe isn't secondhand from a book. I have run at least the first 2 habits properly. The others I've assembled from the literature and from watching households I know that run some of them. Where I know the mechanism from experience, I'll say so. Where I know it from the book, I'll say so. The framework you'll see most of the 10 habits sit inside comes from a specific book, Fumiko Chiba's Kakeibo, The Japanese Art of Saving Money, published by Penguin in 2017. And behind that book, from a year, Motoko Hani, Japan's first female newspaper journalist, launched a women's magazine in 1904 that ran monthly features on household bookkeeping. She published a small ruled notebook alongside the magazine. The notebook had 4 columns. Those 4 columns are the foundation of Japanese household finance for the next century and change. The first habit is the notebook itself. Habit 1, Kakeibo, pronounced roughly Kakeibo, literally the household account book. 4 columns, drawn by hand, in ink, on paper, not an app, not a spreadsheet. The insistence on hand and paper is the whole point of the habit, and is where 9 out of 10 Western imports of Kakeibo lose the mechanism. The 4 columns are these. Column 1, needs, rent, utilities, groceries, transportation to work, the medications you cannot skip, the minimums on debt. Column 2, wants, coffee out, restaurant meals, streaming subscriptions, the impulse purchases, the new pair of shoes when the current pair isn't broken yet. Column 3, culture and self-improvement. Books, courses, the museum admission, the concert ticket, the language class, the therapist. Column 4, extras, unexpected, one-off. The car repair, the wedding gift, the medical bill that wasn't budgeted, the trip home for a funeral. Every expense, at the end of every day, sometimes at the end of every week if you can't manage daily, gets a line in one of those four columns, handwritten with pen. Not from memory, from receipts, from bank alerts, from wherever the transaction happened. And the sum at the bottom of each column at the end of the month is what you spent that month, sorted into four categories that no bank statement will ever sort for you. The reason it has to be handwritten is that the friction is the mechanism. When you have to physically pick up a pen and write a dollar amount under wants for the fourth coffee this week, the wants column becomes visible to you in a way that no app can make visible. The visibility is the entire lever. The bank statement shows you a list. The Kakeibo shows you a shape. Chiba's book puts it this way: the goal of Kakeibo is not to reduce spending, the goal is to know the shape of your spending. Reduction happens automatically when the shape becomes visible, because most of the reduction comes from column 2, and column 2 is invisible until it is written down. Run the numbers yourself. If you kept the Kakeibo for 1 month, you would find on the low end that column 2 consumes 15% of your take-home. On the high end, 30%. That isn't moral failure. That's the default architecture of modern American consumer life. Kakeibo doesn't fix it by scolding you, it fixes it by showing it to you. Habit 2. Mottainai. Pronounced roughly mottainai. There's no clean English equivalent. The word carries in Japanese a quality of deep regret at waste, with a spiritual undertone that Western frugality doesn't quite capture. It isn't cheap. It isn't even strictly speaking thrifty. It's the internal wince at discarding something that still has usable life in it. Mottainai applied to food means you eat what's already in the refrigerator before you buy new food. Applied to clothing, it means you wear the shirt with a small stain another 2 years and repair the tear instead of replacing the garment. Applied to appliances, it means you use the coffee maker until the heating element fails, not until a slightly nicer coffee maker appears in a friend's kitchen. The wabi-sabi aesthetic, the appreciation of imperfection and impermanence in objects, sits directly underneath mottainai as a cultural support structure. The object with the visible mend, the pot with the small crack, the wooden bowl worn smooth in the places your hands touch it most. These are considered more beautiful in the tradition, not less. The visible history of use is what makes the object valuable. That posture, applied consistently across a household over a lifetime, replaces roughly 40% of what an American household buys in the same window. You don't need to adopt the aesthetic to get the financial benefit. What you need is the emotional loop that closes when you throw something functional away. That loop is the mechanism. If throwing away half a container of leftovers produces a small internal wince, the same kind of wince you'd feel setting a $100 bill on fire, the leftovers don't get thrown away, they get eaten. And the loop, run 1,000 times a year, is worth roughly 30 to 50% of a typical American household's discretionary spend. Habit 3. Hara hachibu, pronounced roughly hara hachibu. This is the Confucian teaching, popularized in Okinawa, that translates to eating until you're 80% full. It was originally a dietary principle. Long-lived Okinawans have historically finished meals when they felt about 80% satiated, leaving the remaining 20% uneaten, and the practice has been credited in longevity research with contributing to their extended lifespans. The financial application takes the same principle and applies it to income. Live on 80% of what you earn. Direct the other 20% to savings and investment automatically. The 20% isn't a target you aspire to, it's a floor you never violate. Now, the Bank of Japan flow of funds data I mentioned at the top, this is where the number comes from. 20% isn't a Japanese cultural quirk, it's a floor that a specific subset of Japanese households, running the practice deliberately, hit consistently across generations. The population-wide rate averaged 15 to 25% for decades because a large enough fraction of households ran the practice deliberately. The American saving rate is closer to 5%, not because Americans lack discipline, but because the practice of committing to a floor before spending has never taken structural hold in the American consumer economy. 20% run for 30 years at reasonable market returns. Call it the trailing average of the S&P 500, roughly 7% real, on a median household income around $60,000, produces something in the range of $1.2 to $1.4 million in a brokerage or retirement account by year 30. That isn't aspiration, that's the arithmetic. On the same income, without the 20% floor, the same household reaches 65 with somewhere between $100,000 and $300,000 depending on how the last decade shakes out. Same salary, two habits, 1.2 million versus 200,000. Work it backward from the outcome and the entire spread comes from one line, the 20% floor held for 3 decades without exception. Here is where I want to sit for a second with something that most American imports of harahachibu miss. The 20% floor, standing alone, does not work. I know this because I watched myself try to run it, standing alone, at least twice before the Kakeibo experiment. Once around 2017 and once around 2019, and both times the floor collapsed inside 4 months. The reason it collapsed is that the 20% by itself is a target you have to enforce with willpower, and willpower runs out. What holds the 20% in the Japanese practice is that it sits inside 7 or 8 other habits, and each of the other habits removes some load from willpower. The Kakeibo makes wants visible. The mottainai posture reduces replacement spending. The kaizen posture prevents backlash. The pay yourself first automation removes the transfer decision entirely. Take any one of these out and the floor gets brittle. Take 3 out and the floor is gone by month 6. This is why the Western import of the 20% rule fails so often. It's exported without the load-bearing structure around it. Habit 4. Kaizen. Pronounced roughly Kaizen. This one you may have heard of because the Toyota production system exported the concept to Western manufacturing management in the 1980s. Kaizen means continuous incremental improvement, 1% better every day forever. Applied to money, Kaizen is the alternative to the dramatic financial reset. Instead of announcing on January 1st that you are cutting your spending by 30% and doubling your savings rate, a resolution that fails statistically within about 11 days, you commit to reducing spending in one category by 1% this month, and 1 more percent next month, and 1 more the month after. The math is straightforward. 1% monthly, compounded, produces a 12.7% reduction over a year. 10% monthly, if you could hold it, would produce a much bigger reduction. But you cannot hold 10% monthly. Nobody can. The reason Kaizen works and dramatic resets fail is that the 1% step is below the threshold of psychological resistance, and the 10% step is above it. That isn't motivation. That's how the brain adjudicates change. Watch how this works. Cut the food delivery spend by 1% this month. 1 skipped order and a month of 18 orders. Move the retirement contribution up by 1% of gross next quarter, from 6% to 7%, a change so small your paycheck doesn't register it. Renegotiate one recurring bill down by 1%. Individually invisible, compounded across 2 years, the household has cut discretionary spend by 25% and increased retirement contribution by 4 points, without anyone in the household noticing they made a sacrifice. That's where most people drop out, trying to make the big change instead of the small one. The Kaizen posture is the opposite. The small change, held forever, is the whole strategy. Brief aside, because this is the natural rest in the walkthrough, if you've stayed with this so far, the channel already knows something about you. You're running the long count. Subscribing here is just the marker that you're in the same room as the ledger. Not loud about it, just present. The walk continues. Habit 5. Ikigai, pronounced roughly Ikigai. This is the concept that has been overexported in English language self-help publishing, usually as a Venn diagram involving passion and calling and profession and mission. That framing isn't wrong exactly, it's just incomplete. Ikigai in the financial context is simpler than the diagram. Ikigai is the reason you get up on a Wednesday morning, not the aspirational reason, the actual reason. When a household savings are tied explicitly in writing in the Kakeibo margins to a specific ikigai, the savings survive 15 years of drift that untied savings do not. Untied savings over 15 years get liquidated. Not all at once, in small unemergencies. A vacation that was really a decompression, a car upgrade that was really an identity purchase, a home renovation that was really boredom. Untied savings are structurally savings looking for a reason to leave the account. Tied savings, tied to a specific ikigai, like a household's intention to open a small ceramic studio at 58, or to live near an aging parent starting at 52, or to fund one child's postgraduate education, hold. They hold because the money isn't sitting in the account as abstract number, it's sitting in the account as this specific future. Open your account right now. Look at the number. Ask what the number is for. If the answer is for later, the number will not survive the next decade of your life. If the answer is one specific thing you can describe in a sentence, it probably will. I have watched three households over the last 5 years or so run the tied versus untied experiment without either group calling it that. One household tied roughly 40% of their savings to a specific future, a small vineyard operation in Central California they intended to run in their mid 50s. Another household kept their savings entirely abstract, labeled retirement, no image behind the label. The third household set a savings target and never articulated the reason. 5 years in, the tied household is on trajectory. The abstract retirement household has liquidated roughly a quarter of their savings across three unemergencies. The no reason household closed their brokerage account in year three and rolled the balance into a home renovation that they now describe without much emotion as a mistake. Three data points aren't a study, but the pattern I saw in miniature is exactly the pattern Chiba describes in aggregate. The account holds when the money is attached to a picture, it leaks when it isn't. Habit 6. Nemmatsu o soji, pronounced roughly Nemmatsu o soji. This is the year-end great cleaning, the household ritual most Japanese families run in late December before the new year. Every closet, every drawer, every surface. Nothing enters the new year covered in the residue of the old year. The financial application is the annual audit. Every December or every early January, once a year without exception, the household sits down for one uninterrupted afternoon and audits every recurring financial commitment. Every subscription, every insurance policy, every automatic payment, every investment account, every bank account, every credit card, every service you signed up for and haven't thought about since. The finding every year in every household that runs this properly is between $600 and $2,000 a year of paid for services that nobody in the household uses anymore. The gym membership from 3 years ago, the streaming service you kept for the one show you finished, the insurance policy with the deductible that made the coverage functionally useless, the subscription that renewed at a rate 3 times higher than the introductory rate you signed up for. The idle investment account with the $75 a year maintenance fee. Cut them all at once in one sitting without individually agonizing over each. The savings compound over decades in the same way the 20% floor does. A household running this ritual across a working lifetime catches roughly $40,000 to $80,000 of drift that would otherwise leave the account silently. This is different from the monthly review, which we'll get to. The monthly review handles the specific transactions. The annual audit handles the standing commitments. Both are needed. Neither substitutes for the other. Habit 7. Pay yourself first. This one has an American name. It comes originally in Modern Personal Finance from George Clayson's 1926 book, The Richest Man in Babylon. But the Japanese household version is a specific implementation of the same principle, executed with more discipline than the American version usually is. The principle is simple. The savings transfer runs before the paycheck lands in the primary spending account, not after, before. The employer or the household sets up an automatic split of every paycheck into two transfers. 20% goes directly to a separate account and the remaining 80% goes to the primary spending account. The person receiving the paycheck sees only the 80%. The 20% doesn't exist for their spending purposes. The rent gets paid out of the 80. Groceries get paid out of the 80. Everything gets paid out of the 80. And when the 80 is gone, the month is over. This is the practical application of Parkinson's law, the observation that expenses expand to fill available income. If the household sees 100% of income in the spending account, expenses will find a way to consume close to 100%. If the household sees only 80%, expenses adjust downward to fit the 80 every time, without discipline required. The architecture handles it. Run the numbers yourself. If your take home is 5,000 a month and the automated split moves 1,000 to savings before you see the money, your discretionary decisions are made against a $4,000 budget, and by the end of the year, you have 12,000 in savings that never required a single act of willpower. Left to willpower, that same 12,000 becomes closer to 2. I want to name the failure mode of this habit because I've run into it and have watched other households run into it. The failure mode is not that the split doesn't work. The failure mode is that people set the split too aggressively at the start, feel the compression in month 1 and month 2, and reverse the split rather than adjusting other habits to absorb the compression. The Kaizen posture matters here specifically. Start the split at 10%, not 20. Hold it for a quarter, then step it up by 1 point and hold that for a quarter. Then another. By month 24, you're at 15% without ever having felt the compression. By month 48, you're at 20. That is the operational bridge from where you are to where the practice sits. If you try to jump straight to 20, the failure rate is high. Not because the mechanism doesn't work, but because you didn't give the household budget time to reshape around the smaller number. Habit 8. The free leisure principle. Most Japanese households historically have organized rest and recreation around activities that cost nothing or almost nothing. Long walks in local parks, visits to public libraries, cooking a meal at home for a group of friends, gardening, sitting in a public bath, reading, meditative practice, cleaning the house together, watching seasonal changes. The American default over the last 4 decades has quietly become the opposite: rest that must be purchased. The weekend restaurant meal, the streaming subscription, the vacation package, the bar tab, the concert ticket, the theme park. The idea that recreation requires transaction has been culturally installed in a way that most Americans no longer notice as a choice. The financial cost of the paid recreation default is not primarily the individual transactions. The cost is the compounded difference over a lifetime. If you default recreation costs on average $80 per weekend, and someone else's default recreation costs $8 per weekend, the $72 per week spread invested at reasonable returns over 40 years is roughly $600,000. That isn't a small effect. That's the difference between a modest retirement and a comfortable one on identical incomes. You don't have to eliminate paid recreation entirely. You just have to change the default. Rest in this posture is the default. Paid rest is the occasional exception, not the automatic assumption. Habit 9. The monthly review. Run without guilt. On the first weekend of every month, sometimes the first weekday, whichever the household prefers, the Kakeibo comes out. The 4 columns get totaled, and the household spends about 30 minutes reviewing the shape of the previous month. The word review is important here, and it is different from the American word budget. A review isn't a punishment, it isn't a report card, it doesn't produce a verdict of you did well or you did badly. A review is a mechanism for pattern recognition. Where did the money go last month? Was that pattern the one you wanted? What one small change in the Kaizen posture would you like to make for next month? The Japanese practice explicitly excludes shame. You don't call out the person in the household who overspent on column 2. You don't guilt trip the previous month's decisions. You observe the shape and you make one small adjustment and you close the notebook and go on with your life. This is a psychologically load-bearing detail. American budgeting culture has an implicit moral overlay. If the numbers came out worse than expected, someone should feel bad about it. The moral overlay is what kills the practice. People stop reviewing their finances because reviewing them feels like getting a bad grade every month. The Japanese version removes the grade. You just look at the shape and adjust. Ask yourself, honestly, whether you have ever run a financial review of your own household finances without ending it feeling worse about yourself than when you started. If the answer is no, the reason isn't your finances. The reason is the shame overlay. Remove it, and the review becomes something you can actually run every month, indefinitely, for the rest of your working life. Habit 10. Quiet wealth as the target, not accumulation. This is the one that ties the whole system together, and it is the hardest to import into a culture whose default financial goal is visible. Quiet wealth, as the concept is understood in Japan, is the state of having enough that you don't have to think about money anymore. It isn't a specific number, it isn't a lifestyle, it isn't a rank on a list. It's the absence of financial anxiety, achieved through decades of the previous 9 habits, and expressed in a household that looks from the outside exactly like the households around it, with the difference that the account behind it makes almost every problem the neighbors are struggling with soluble at any moment. The visible display of wealth is antithetical to this target, not for moral reasons, for arithmetic reasons. Every dollar spent on display is a dollar not compounding, and the compound of 40 years of undisplayed spread is what buys the quiet. You'll notice once you start looking that the households that reach this state tend to be almost invisible. Same modest house, same modest car, same modest wardrobe, same modest vacations. And behind the modesty, an account that could buy the neighbor's house in cash without noticing. That is the target, not the boat, not the second home, not the retirement announcement dinner, just the quiet. And a bank statement that closes every loop the neighbors are still trying to close with objects. 2 households, 1 salary, same career lifetime income, roughly 80,000 a year in current dollars, over 40 working years. Household A ran the 10 habits from age 25 to 65 without dramatic sacrifice, without unusual discipline. Household B ran the American default from age 25 to 65, also without dramatic sacrifice. At 65, Household A has a paid off house, no debt, $1.4 million in a brokerage account, $180,000 in a separate emergency reserve, and a monthly cost of living that runs about $3,500, which their assets support indefinitely without touching principal. At 65, Household B has a mostly paid off house with $180,000 still on the mortgage, $62,000 in a retirement account, $4,000 in a savings account, $12,000 in credit card debt, and a monthly cost of living that runs about $5,700, which their income does not support, and their retirement account will exhaust in 14 years at drawdown. Same salary, 40 years, 2 different accounts, one difference. The 10 habits held loosely but consistently for 4 decades. The Bank of Japan flow of funds statistics don't show you individual households, they show you the aggregate spread. The spread at the individual level is exactly this, and the individual level is the only level any of this happens on. Motoko Hani was 31 years old when she published the first Kakeibo notebook in 1904. She published it out of a small office in Tokyo, priced it to be affordable for any household, and sold it monthly for the next 32 years. She didn't call her method a philosophy, she called it accounting. The philosophy grew up around the accounting because the accounting worked. That is the whole video. If any of the 10 named the mechanism you had been running without a name for, hit the like button so it moves in the feed of someone else who needs the name. Subscribe to Netsum if you want the count to keep showing up. And drop the habit, the one you already do without calling it by any of these words, in the comments. I read them. The count keeps counting, quietly.